So we saw that, like a lot of theories, utilitarianism, when it was first proposed as a moral theory, was proposed in a very simple quantitative way. Bentham thought that you're fanning yourself back. I know, I guess they decided that it's not worth spending money on air conditioning today, except it's supposed to get up to 82. That's what I'm dressed for. Basically, Bentham thought, look, the only thing we need to worry about is the quantity of pleasures. All pleasures are on a par if their quantity is the same. But that opened utilitarianism up to the criticism. Oh, I mean, folks, you're not here if you leave. And people wonder why we only get 16 to 19% people walking across the stage after 4 years, you know. And I don't care if you tell her I said that about her and everybody else. Do you really think at this stage of the game I care what any student thinks? You know, I've been doing this almost 30 years, folks. You know, a lot of people have come and gone. That's teaching 3 to 5 courses a semester, and some in the summer and winter, yes.
Right, you keep saying that the term is due on the 9th. That's a Tuesday. So is it going to be due the 8th or the 10th?
It says the 8th on Blackboard.
Oh yeah, the Blackboard says 8th.
Okay, what are you talking about?
The term, you said numerous times just now the 9th, but the 9th is the Tuesday.
Oh, all right. Well, I meant it to be due on a Monday. Isn't it on the 8th? Don't I have an announcement saying it's the 8th? Okay. Okay, I don't. I did that off the top of my head, but thanks for double checking that. So it's due the 8th. Maybe I'll put a extra reminder there. So I said, utilitarianism started out as a very simple theory. All we need to worry about is the quantity of pleasures and comparing them in terms of their quantity. And we saw that Bentham thought you could figure out actual numerical values for pleasures and pains by taking into account things like intensity of a pleasure or pain, duration in time, certainty or uncertainty, and then other more subtle things like whether a pleasure is going to produce more pleasure or pain. And we saw that this thought that you can assign numerical values was probably way too optimistic. However, I've got a later slide here. Modern utilitarianism talks in terms of an economic cost-benefit analysis, and we'll look at that before the end of the day. And while it might be hard, if not impossible, to define what a hedon, a countable units worth of pleasure or pain is, because it's subjective, more modern versions of utilitarianism tie the moral rightness of a policy with whether, on balance, it produces more economic benefits than economic costs. And that's another way you can look at the decision of whether or not to do something like build the Bakun Dam? You know, is it going to produce more economic benefits than the costs? And it probably clearly is the case that it will. I think this is one reason why we built these dams in the 20s and 30s and why other countries are doing it now. As I mentioned, China put the largest one in the world online about 3 years ago. But besides the problems with whether or not we can assign exact numerical values to quantities of pleasures and pains, this contention by Bentham that all pleasures and pains are on a par if their quantity is the same opened utilitarianism up to the criticism that it's a moral philosophy that really is giving us a very low view of human nature. That and the reason the pigs here is that they were actually charged with having a pig morality. I mean, that was one of the criticisms, you know, in the 1900s leveled against utilitarianism, because the thought is that if the pig out there in the field gets as much pleasure from eating its daily allotment of slop as you do from, say, going to a concert or reading poetry or something, that if the quantity is the same, all pleasures are on the par. So it sees human beings as just creatures of pain and pleasure, and it tends to put us on the level with non-human animals. And even Bentham, his famous quote about animals is, the question to ask when you're asking whether animals have rights, and some of you might be writing on this topic for your term paper, is not can they talk. Some people have argued the difference between us and non-human animals is we're language users, they're not. But Bentham says the question to ask is not can they talk or can they reason. We saw this with Aristotle and with Aquinas. We can draw a sharp line between human beings and every other living thing on the planet at reason. But he says the question asked is not can they reason or can they talk, but can they suffer? Can they feel pain and pleasure? And if that's the case, he says non-human animals have rights that cause us to have moral duties to them. So Bentham, by the time these criticisms were coming in, that utilitarianism offers us a low view of human nature, was getting very old. And so it was left to John Stuart Mill, his pupil, his star pupil, to defend the theory against these criticisms. And the way Mill originally did this was to try to say, look, which one of us would trade places with the pig out there in the field, even the way he said it, if somebody promised you the fullest allowance of a beast's pleasures, of the pig's pleasures. If somebody said, I mean, we all have problems, right? Even, you know, we see all these people in the news who have fame and fortune, and it doesn't insulate them from having real problems in their lives. You know, suppose a friend of yours says, well, you know, I know you've been going through some hard stuff lately. Said, I've been reading some books on magic, and I'm pretty sure that I can turn you into a pig. And what's more, I can promise you that you're going to be a very happy pig. You know, you want to take the deal. I mean, Which one of us would take that deal? None of us would. Why? Because we realize as human beings, there are things that give value to our lives, things that we can experience and appreciate that the pig in the field knows nothing of. In fact, at one point he says, look, if the pig has a different opinion, this was Mill, then it's because the pig knows only one side of the issue. The pig knows only the pleasures of sensation. But not Hume, but John Stuart Mill said, if we introduce quality, we can see that there are pleasures that human beings can experience that are qualitatively on a different par with the mere pleasures of sensation that we get from eating and drinking. So he said we need to think about quality of pleasures and distinguish higher from lower pleasures. And how do you do this? Mill says, well, you don't ask the pig in the field because he knows only one side of the issue. But you ask somebody who's experienced both sides, and they will have an automatic preference for the higher pleasure. Now, in reality, it's very hard to see that this actually works, right? H.L. Mencken, the famous Baltimore journalist, one of his more famous quotes is, no one ever lost money underestimating the tastes of the American public. I remember one time when I took a friend of mine who was a teacher and was falling asleep down to a classical guitar concert. I don't play classical guitar, but I do play guitar. So here we are, and we're down in the basement of the Walters Art Gallery in a little theater they had then. Maybe around 300 of us, at this highbrow concert, which is exactly the kind of thing that Mill would have thought was a higher pleasure, right? Now, the same night, though, the WWF, probably within less than a mile of where we were, was having, I think what at the time was Super Slam 6 or 7. In other words, the Royal Wrestling Federation had a wrestling match going on, right? Probably not what Mill would have considered a higher pleasure. And yet I think there were probably a few more people down at the Civic Arena that night than in the basement of the Walters Art Gallery. And what's more, I'll bet you some of those people watching wrestling that day, and when we were kids, we used to write away for free tickets for Saturday morning wrestling at the TV studio because we could walk to it. But at any rate, I'll bet you some of the people watching wrestling that day knew very well what classical guitar music sounds like. And yet that wasn't their automatic choice. I mean, I've even known philosophy professors to have spent a Sunday afternoon rather than going to a highfalutin concert or opera, spend it watching the Ravens. I don't want to mention any names because I don't want to get anybody in trouble. So Mill says you ask the person who's experienced both and they'll automatically have a preference for the higher pleasure. Probably doesn't work out in real life, right? But at any rate, he thought by distinguishing pleasures regarding quantity, he could respond to some of these criticisms that say utilitarianism is a theory that gives us a low view of human beings. He says, well, human beings prefer what he calls the pleasures of intellect and imagination. In other words, works of art are produced by the intellect and the imagination. And he says those are superior to pleasures of mere sensation like eating and drinking. Now, here's the problem, though. This philosophy of hedonism, which they both claimed, Bentham and Mill, to espouse, says there's only one thing that has value in and of itself. It's pleasure or happiness. Everything else is valuable only insofar as it aims at the promotion of pleasure or happiness, or the lessening of pain and unhappiness. But Mill says, it's better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool or a pig satisfied. In other words, it's better to have a lesser amount of a higher quality pleasure like Socrates might have had discussing philosophical issues with his friends and fellow philosophers. Better to do that than to be a fool who's just experiencing the pleasures of sensation, but is very satisfied. Well, if you then ask what makes the higher pleasures distinguishable from the lower, one answer you cannot give is pleasure alone. Because here's Socrates, and he's actually got a lower quantity of pleasure. He's dissatisfied, but he's got a higher quality pleasure. And if that's preferable, then the reason these so-called higher pleasures are preferable is not to be found in pleasure alone, which is what the hedonists would have to maintain, but in their saying that there are other things valuable, inherently valuable about these other sorts of pleasures that make them preferable. And to say that is to say that there are other standards of value being sneaked in here. And to do that is to abandon hedonism. So Mill claimed to be a hedonist, but this move of saying pleasures can differ in quality as well as quantity, and that it's better to have a higher quality pleasure even if you have a lower quantity, abandons hedonism, which says pleasure alone. So what makes higher pleasures higher? Can't be pleasure alone, as I just said. This standard, it sneaks in some other standard of value. And contemporary philosophers, and Jonathan Glover in that video was an example of it, are actually pluralists. They abandon hedonism and say there are a number of different standards of value. And so when we talk about plural, things like knowledge is a good in and of itself, self-realization or the satisfaction of our preferences. Things like this have been also talked about as worthy in and of themselves. So a lot of contemporary utilitarians abandon hedonism. They're not just hedonists in the style of Bentham and Mill. And so in order to defend hedonism, Mill actually abandons it. And so at any rate, so this overtly abandons hedonism because while it recognizes pleasure as good in itself, it denies the hedonist claim that pleasure or happiness alone is the only thing that's good for its own sake alone, and says there are other things that are valuable for their own sakes. And again, I said, if you're used to thinking of moral principles as ethereal things out there somewhere, again, Hume gave skeptical arguments against that view that these people are trying to react against. They're trying to get morality down to earth by making moral decisions to be concerned with things that we actually empirically experience here in the world we live in, like things like human pleasures and pains. So, I made this point. A lot of contemporary utilitarian reasoning combines an accounting cost-benefit analysis with the claim that the morally right decision in terms of a public policy is what gives us economically more benefits than the costs involved. So here we don't have the problem of figuring out what's to count as one unit for utilitarian reasoning, because while it may be hard to specify what a hedon is, it's not hard to specify what a dollar is. So it uses readily countable economic units like dollars and cents, views the morally good as economic benefits and the morally bad as economic costs. And in a single payer healthcare system, to give you an example of this, single payer, because what? Who's the single payer? The government. We don't have that here yet. The Obama administration tried to introduce a halfway measure, and for many people that was only a step on the way to a single payer system. They do have a single payer system in places like Australia, Canada, Cuba, and Great Britain. And so now Medicare, if you're a physician and you deem that you need a particular operation, even if it's very costly, Medicare may pay for it. The direction that it was going to go in, and it may not go that way now, and Peter Singer wrote a big article in the New York Times Magazine saying, look, of course, Obamacare would lead to rationing of health care. It would lead, the British system uses QALY, quality adjusted life years. And so when they figure out whether we should spend money as a society to give you that operation that may save your life, they're saying, well, what are we going to get on the other side of it? Are you going to have enough quality adjusted life years after the operation to justify the cost? And if the answer, is to them no, then you don't get that funded, And so that's just one example. And of course, with something like the Bakun Dam, you can ask whether the economic benefits of building that dam justify the costs. So this is one way that you see utilitarian reasoning in contemporary policy decisions. So this is utilitarian reasoning because it weighs the morally good in terms of economic benefits against the morally bad economic costs, and it recommends that you choose on the side of the most benefits or the least costs for all involved. So just to consider some pluses and minuses of the theory. So utilitarians, again, would argue that a big benefit of this type of moral reasoning is that it's concrete. And again, this is one of the leading theories of secular ethics, folks. If you guys take any kind of specialized ethics course, you will have a unit on utilitarian reasoning. So it removes morality from the realm of the transcendent and otherworldly. Morality, moral right and wrong, isn't a matter of following the commands of a transcendent God. They did not. Both Bentham and Mill argue that they don't have an anti-religious theory, but the point is their theory enables you to talk about moral right and wrong and leave theological considerations for or against on the side. And it's not a matter of thinking there are abstract moral principles in the nature of the universe, but it just becomes a matter of promoting people's pleasure or happiness or lessening their pain in this real world that you and I live in. Now you may be uninterested, right? But the word here is disinterested. To take a disinterested perspective on something is to stand back from a decision and approach it as if it does not affect you, even if it does. And for Bentham, in utilitarian reasoning, this is what we're supposed to do. In other words, the benefits to us count in utilitarian calculations, but no more than the effects, good or bad, on anyone else affected by our actions. So we figure in the mix in utilitarian calculations, but no more than anyone else affected by what we do. So it allows us to stand back from a moral decision and say, well, what's the right thing to do here? Even if it might not be the course of action that benefits me the most. And we saw, if you go back and look at the uncle's pains and pleasures, what he deems as the right thing to do on utilitarian grounds is take his nephew to the circus, but that's not the option that gives him the most happiness. So it can support altruism, which egoism can't do. Egoism can't say put the interests of others above your own, essentially, because it says your interests are the only thing that matter from a moral point of view. The consequences for you, that's ethical egoism. I'm not going to ask you questions on it, but just to put it in perspective. Whereas utilitarianism says, no, we want to worry about the consequences for all affected. So it can support altruism, can support our even doing some self-sacrificing for the good of others. So you can say it's straightforward and objective, just a matter of plugging in the values. Of course, the problem is, even though you're supposed to be entirely subjective, the way it works out in practice is not exactly that. Anybody remember the story of the Ford Pinto? Now, Pintos were around before you guys were born, like in the 70s. Well, it was a car, and I used to drive a Ford. It was an Escort, not a Pinto. So I'm not trashing Ford, right? But the car was built with a rear engine and a gas tank in the rear, and there wasn't sufficient shoring up of the gas tank. And some of these cars would burst into flames at low-end collisions, 20, 25 miles an hour on the back, and the car bursts into flame. So Ford basically was told there's an $11 part that would shore up the gas tank and significantly lessen the chance. And so basically, the thought is, are you going to recall all these vehicles? Remember, this is in the 70s before you got all these consumer lawsuits that are so common today. And Ford thought, well, we can put in this part to tens of thousands of vehicles at $11 per, and it's going to cost us X amount of dollars. Or if we they took a government figure for the value of a human life, and they said, let's take this figure and we'll multiply it. If we don't put it in, we're going to fry to a crisp a certain number of people at X dollars per and injure more. And so they worked out the math, and they said, well, look, much more, they took the cost to society to be the cost to Ford, and they say it would cost much more versus the benefits to put the part in. So the morally right thing for us to do is to do nothing. Well, look, you say, well, was that a real objective decision, or are they trying to? Now, of course, it didn't take into account multi-million-dollar lawsuits. But at any rate, realistic, recognizes real morality must balance out the interests of many against the few. Again, as we said, the policy of eminent domain, which justifies the taking of private property for public use, like we did across the street, is utilitarian, right? It says that yes, we're going to cause some pain and suffering in the minds of a limited number of people who may not want to move, may not want to lose their home, but there'll be the benefits over many years of the people who are going to use, say, the new science building and have their education supported. Or there were houses in back of me that were torn down shortly after my parents moved where we live now, I still own the house, in the 50s. And those houses were torn down, and a few years later they dredged the whole hillside out, and it's now the off-ramp, the Falls Road off-ramp to the Jones Falls Expressway. Maybe those people didn't want to move, but eminent domain said. But objections requires too much. Predicting future consequences is very hard, right? How many consequences do you have to take into account, and do you have them all covered? And obviously, if you're talking in terms of other people's pains and pleasures, very hard to predict that. I once dated for a while a divorcee with 2 young children, and we went to a county fair outside of Charlottesville. I was in grad school at the time. They were advertising a demolition derby. And being a kid growing up in the big city, right, I like to see cars ramming into one another, destroying one another, Typical kid from the big city. These were country kids. I bought us an extra ticket, we went. They didn't enjoy it at all. In fact, they were a little afraid. They thought they were going to explode. I didn't realize at the time that they take out the real gas tanks and they put a quart plastic jug for the gasoline. So there's very, very little chance that you're going to get any kind of a fire in the demolition derby. But I didn't know that at the time. In other words, it's very hard to predict. There was a time when Uncle Vic had to realize that it's not good for Uncle Vic to guess what my niece and little nephews want for Christmas. Far better to get them a gift card and let them decide what they want. Because very hard to predict what somebody's going to like or not like. Note how if the guy's going to enjoy the book tremendously because he's been waiting, say, for the latest Michael Crichton or something, and the kid doesn't enjoy the circus, maybe the right thing to do is to stay home and read the book and not take the kid to the circus. So very hard to predict future pains and pleasures. And even with public projects, I mean, there's a project called the Big Dig in Boston, right? Boston's by the sea. They had all kinds of problems. I mean, I think the thing went 4 or 5 times over the original estimate. The Big Dig was a huge subway and road system. And even when they opened it, you know, week or two after they opened it, somebody got killed in a car because a big chunk of concrete, because of the moisture and all, came off and hit him in the front windshield. Very hard to predict what consequences are going to be. You know, it requires us to compare very different things, like how much extra overtime do I have to put in a job I don't like to be able to buy a newer TV, you know. But we do, it's true, we do make these, you know, calculations. You know, again, forces us to abandon rights. Some would say it's wrong, say, to deny somebody their property rights by taking their property for public use via eminent domain and stuff like this, you know. And the thought is, well, if utilitarian reasoning justifies that, then there's a problem. The slippery slope argument against legalizing active euthanasia, where you actively give somebody a needle that kills them, not just take them off a machine, that's called passive euthanasia, is, well, if it's legal, would patients be subtly pressured to do the right thing and not cost the state any more, you know, in keeping them alive if they're terminally ill, but just, you know, let them whisk you out of the world, you know. The utilitarian reasoning may say it's a good thing that we pressure people to do that, but some people would say, well, that violates things like their basic right to life, you know. So utilitarianism is controversial, recommends immoral actions. One utilitarian argued that we can justify having love affairs and committing adultery by utilitarian reasoning if it produces more pleasure than pain. And you say, well, it would really pain my spouse if they found out. Well, the same person, Richard Taylor, says, well, then utilitarian reasoning can justify your lying to your spouse about the affair, you know, to not cause them pain. And it's things like this. Now, look, I go into a discussion that I don't go into in intro on the difference between act and rule utilitarianism. I use the same slides in general ethics courses or business ethics courses where we get a little deeper in the weeds on this. But don't worry about the stuff at the end if you see it there on act and rule utilitarianism. But, okay, I don't want to make anybody late. The roll is somewhere around. If you missed it, sign it on the way out, please. And we'll see you Wednesday. I got to figure out what we're doing. We may start doing some review Wednesday. Again, I made this PowerPoint visible to you. I thought it was there. Let me up.